Hey there, friends, and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where three rakishly handsome certified Pro Tools experts and avid instructors discuss, demonstrate, and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in the official Avid support forum on Facebook. I'm your host, Dave Phillips, audio engineer and lecturer based in the UK. And today we are tackling a question from Stephan, who asks the following. I'm not sure if grouping tracks in Pro Tools to a stem via an aux fader with no inserts, or directly and controlling the group with a VCA fader makes a sonic difference. In other words, does an aux fader have a sound? In an analog desk, it would make a difference. Interesting subject, I think. There's a couple.
Great question.
There's a couple of things in there to talk about. Before I do, I just want to give a shout out to our Patreon supporters who generously support us each month. Many thanks to Don, Mike, Matthew, Gregor, and to our new donator, Eric, as well, who give generously each month to the channel. Their kind support is very much appreciated. If we're helping you to become a Pro Tools expert and would like to support us to keep our work going, you too can head over to patreon.com/Pro Tools Answers. Select a manageable tier, each with their own scaling benefits and gifts, and we will be able to radiate appreciation upon you as well. We really would. And joining me as ever is the personification of epic, Mr. Anders Motz over at Tonkraftwerk in Austria.
Hello.
Am I saying this right, Anders? We've been doing this for a while now. Have I got the pronunciation of Tonkraftwerk?
Yeah, it's
correct?
Perfect. Awesome.
I'm just trying to figure out who Tom Kraftwerk is.
Well, it's a game of of words actually in German. Yeah, we'll get into that over a beer in the Patreon bar.
Indeed.
There you go.
And keeping us honest, he's usually 100% right and 0% wrong. It's Mr. Andy Hageman, Avid's audio curriculum manager. He's in Tokyo. Hi, Andy.
How's it going? Konbanwa, which means good evening.
Awesome. It's 12:40 here today.
It's coming up on 10 p.m. over here.
Oh, you give away your evenings so generously.
I do. I have that. This is giving away the fact that I have absolutely no social life whatsoever.
See, for me and Anders, we also pretty much give up a day, because if we're doing this for 2 hours in the middle of a working day, we can't do sessions. We love you guys that much. We're prepared to give up an entire day of working just so
we do it. And we do it without sponsorship. There was I think on maybe on the same Facebook thread, somebody said, check out Pro Tools Answers. I think they're sponsored by Avid. They're not. We have 3 ACIs, one guy that works for Avid, but does Avid sponsor us? No. Dude, we'd be more than happy for Avid to sponsor us and pay us to make Pro Tools Answers and to teach people about Pro Tools. If someone wants to pay us to do it, awesome. At the moment, we will take that money.
Yeah, we have our wonderful patrons who help us in that regard, and we also have our merch as well. People starting to pick up the jerseys that Anders looks so incredibly handsome in.
You do too.
They're like milkshake, don't you think? I think they're bringing all the boys to Anders' yard.
Oh dear God.
Let's put a pin in that one. Stephen's question. So where shall we end up on this one? Because he's talking about using auxes as subgroups. It's running a whole bunch of tracks through an auxiliary, and what do we use those for? We use those for the purposes of subgrouping instruments. We use them as for 2-bus processing. We use them for effects returns. Can we use that term returns, Andy? I feel like we've used that before and you were uncomfortable with it.
I'm getting, yes. I mean, theoretically, it serves the function of an effects return. It's not exactly the same as on an analog console having built-in returns. But yeah, I mean, I'm all right with it. But yeah, so you use a send. The send is going out of a bus. The bus is input to an aux track, and the aux track is the house in which the reverbs and delays and stuff like that reside. So yeah, no, I mean, we can call it a return. I'm good with it.
Okay, cool. So it's essentially what the aux track is. It's a pass-through. It's an audio pass-through. It's a track that doesn't record anything. It doesn't play anything back. you just literally pass audio through it, and you can affect it in with the inserts, and you can send it through different places with the sends, the outputs. It's an audio pass through. He's also referencing VCAs,
right?
The VCA fader, and he could just be referencing the fact that he's using a VCA to control the tracks before they hit the thing. But it's kind of also making an inference that the VCA is also having a sonic effect as well, which I find interesting.
Well, can we kind of differentiate? Can we talk about Auxes in subgroups for just a second? Because one of the things that was cool about that question was all the responses that came in. There were some really interesting ones, and one was really interesting to me. Was basically saying, don't use too many aux tracks in sequence because of the delay that you can get. And immediately I thought, there is no delay because, well, there is delay. There's about 10 samples of delay for every bus that goes from one place to another. But that's compensated for by automatic delay compensation. So I immediately said, hey, wait a second. No, there really isn't. When automatic delay compensation is on, there's no problem. And then he moved on to say it's not a good practice to get into because of the coloration and the sometimes deleterious effects that multiple routing from one to one can have in an analog environment, which I thought was a really interesting idea. I mean, if you're going to bounce from a DAW mixing inside the box and mixing outside the box, there's a different kind of a philosophy on how readily you use aux tracks and groups. And I think when you're in Pro Tools, it's one of the first places I go. Do I create master faders? Do I create aux tracks all the time? And I don't give it a second thought. Absolutely. But that's not the kind of mix complexity that you should go for in an analog situation because of all the problems that this person mentioned.
The stacking of coloration, effectively.
Well, yeah, depending upon the board and depending upon the routing, you can, you're basically going through multiple circuits that are adding color upon color, and that can have a coloring effect, or even sometimes a timing effect. In Pro Tools, as long as automatic delay compensation is on, that's a non-issue inside of Pro Tools. But for those who are trying to maintain a workflow that's equally at home in the analog studio and mixing inside the box, I thought that reply was really interesting and insightful.
So the question about does it color the sound, is there does Aux Tracks have a sound? I think we would probably deal with that. None of the tracks inside Pro Tools, or possibly even any DAW that doesn't have any kind of analog processing involved in the chain naturally, it doesn't have any kind of color, doesn't provide any kind of color.
That's right. So in any DAW, in any good DAW, certainly Pro Tools, the strength of the DAW is its ability to resist coloration. So that you can add color, with your effects and the actual routing from one place to another doesn't add color. Now it can add latency, right? But only if automatic delay compensation is off. And that kind of phase, if you have automatic delay compensation off and you've got subgroups cascading into other subgroups, could you get into phase issues? Yes, and that can definitely color the sound, but that's a timing issue, not a circuitry issue, because obviously there's no circuitry.
How far might you have gone in the past to stack subgroups?
Just thinking... Anders, I'll let you do that before I tip my hand.
I probably had maybe 3 or 4 subgroups within subgroups going into another subgroup.
When I work with virtual instruments, very often I'll layer virtual instruments. So for example, I'm working on a jazz piece right now, and I've got each sax part is actually 2 virtual instruments playing in unison, and I'm blending both those. Those are both going to a routing folder track, just because it's easy for me to fold it up, and so I've got each one of the 5 saxes is a folder track with 2 tracks inside of it. Those folder tracks are going to a sax aux track, or actually a sax folder track and routing folder track, which is subgroups going to another subgroups. That all goes to something I usually do is I have a main subgroup, which is where all my tracks dump into.
Like a submaster.
Yeah, Well, yeah, right. So it's an aux track though, because I want those pre-fader pre-fader inserts, which is only going to be on the aux, and then that's followed by a master fader giving me the post-fader insert. So I've got the best of both worlds at the end of my block. So I could very easily get 3, 4, 5 sometimes layers deep, but I don't worry about it as long as automatic delay compensation is on.
No, and it's as we said, it's not going to introduce anything. We'll just show my session here briefly, and it's kind of similar to what Andy was talking about.
Can we just go one step back, because I'm sure there are some viewers now looking at this and thinking like, let's clear the terminology. Like, what is he trying to do? And he's trying to do similar things using 2 different techniques, right? One of them being outputting a bunch of tracks with similar features, like all of your drums, to an aux track, to be able to control the volume of all of those drums, meaning control the sum of those, right?
Right.
So you have one volume fader. Whereas the other version, where you have a VCA fader, you have the tracks grouped, and you can move all of the faders in the track by moving the VCA fader instead, right?
Well,
it's
yeah.
And maybe VCA isn't the best description for it. VCA stands for voltage controlled amplifier, right? And it should be DCA, digitally controlled amplifier, because that's what we're doing.
Well, it's not really even an amplifier anymore.
So
and that's where some of the terms are getting confused between doors as well. I think, and maybe and also back into the live mixing space as well, where we've got but then we've also got VCAs in synths. They're using the same terminology.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's,
and they were the same exact thing. So on an old analog synth, a VCA was a voltage controlled amplifier that controlled other amplifiers with voltage. On the old analog consoles, you had a VCA track, and there was no audio. And this is the first of the key points. There was no audio passing through that VCA track. It looked like there was, right? It was a fader just like everything else, but it was just sending control voltage that would move other tracks. So you would have your classic live example would be your drum tracks are all assigned to a VCA track that was basically you move one and all of them adjust up or down, and it was voltage control, because that's what we had back in the analog days. Now that we're in Pro Tools, it's still called a VCA for historic reasons, but obviously there's no amplification and it's certainly not voltage controlled, but it does the same kind of thing. There's no audio going through that VCA track, which is I think the single most important factor in whether or not you go with an aux track or with a VCA track or both.
Do you know, this is one of the things that I love about working in the Pro Tools environment, is that the app still recognizes the traditional terms. So the fact that we're using a VCA, it makes sense to me, because it's a traditional work flow.
Yep. Sorry, playing music there.
And I think that it's important to maintain those traditional terms and apply them correctly.
Absolutely. So given that an aux track doesn't color the sound, and given the fact that there's no audio going through a VCA track at all, there's no sonic difference in and of itself between a VCA controlling 5 different tracks and 5 different tracks going through an aux. That there's no sonic difference there at all.
No.
But what happens is where the signal flow for a subgroup comes in, and how you want to control it and where you want to control it.
And what you want to do with it, right?
Well, indeed. So I wanted to show this session here, and I think you guys have got probably something similar to demonstrate as well. Is that let's just look at this this drum group here. I've got all of my drum tracks routed through a single bus heading to this folder track, which is essentially my auxiliary, and we can just see signal happening there. So this is effectively being the overall volume control for my drum outputs. And then if I wanted to adjust the amount of signal heading into that group, I can use the individual tracks themselves, which I thought these were all grouped. Oh, the fact that there's a VCA attached to them is taking control away. So if I've got all of these tracks grouped now, we can see that the signal going out of the individual tracks heading into the auxiliary is completely disappearing. And the grouping allows me to control all of those in tandem, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So the fact that the audio is flowing through the bus and into the auxiliary, there's no coloration there involved at all until I want to introduce some of my own. And actually, I'm using a tape track here, which is completely the wrong thing. I think I might have been using this to demonstrate to a student a while ago. I would be using something like, if I can find it, Slate's virtual.
Ahead search.
So Dave, just let me while we're paused on this, let's just clear up a couple things because I'm afraid we're using terms without defining them. We were talking about routing folder tracks. A routing folder track, for those of you who haven't used a routing folder track, is a basic folder track plus an aux track. So in these cases, what Dave is showing here is a number of drum tracks going to a routing folder track. It's acting exactly as if it was an aux track. There's no signal flow difference between a routing folder and an aux. No. It just has that extra convenience of being a folder you can dump stuff in. The other thing, Dave, if you could do something real quick for me, and you'll see why in just a second. Can you rename the output of any of your drum tracks to drums bus?
The output of my drum track, or my the routing folder. The output of the, let's say, kick in. Perfectly, that one right there. Just do a right click on that and rename that to drums bus, and you'll see why in just a second. 2 S's. My choice.
We're still working on aluminium. That's fine. I pick my battles.
Okay, so that's renamed.
Great. As you were. Continuing on.
Oh, are you just correcting my workflow here?
No, but I'll tell you why. Is the drum bus is where audio signal's going through, but you also had a group named drums.
I've got my actual routing folder is called drums because everything is culminating in here. When I fold it down, I can just use that output to control my entire drum output.
Understood, but you also had a mix group, which is what the VCA fader was using, called drums. And what the VCA fader is when you choose drums from the VCA fader, it's not the drums bus, it's the drums group.
Great stuff. That's a very good distinction to make, yes. So let's just deal with the coloration issue first. The track on its own doesn't introduce any coloration, as we've discussed. If we want to introduce coloration, we'd use something like Slate's virtual mix bus, not the actual the channel strip. Slightly different circuitry that it's modeling, isn't it, within a desk context. So I'm using the mix bus on a subgroup to kind of simulate the signal arriving at a mix bus in a real mixer. So that's how we can introduce coloration if we wanted to. What about heat, guys?
Yeah, great question.
Great question.
Can you turn it on, Dave?
Heat is active.
You've got it. Heat is active. And as you can see here, heat is active on each individual track, but not the aux itself.
Right. So heat being an emulation of how an analog console thinks only applies to audio tracks. And this works for you in most cases. So in other words, if you're going to saturate all of your audio tracks that are feeding an aux, you don't want that aux also to be saturated because your mix can get out of control very, very quickly. So the way that it works is that heat only applies to audio tracks. Now this, for people like me and you two, I think, when you're using virtual instruments are on instrument tracks, which are also modified aux tracks, and they're not modified by heat.
No.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use it, so that's where you commit the track and change and create basically an audio track version of it, and that's what I usually use when mixing if I want to put heat on my virtual instruments.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
totally. I do that a lot. Yeah.
freezing doesn't do it. You have to commit it, right?
You have to commit it. Yep. It has to be an audio track. Yep.
Okay, so coloration can be introduced on the source tracks using heat, or it can be obviously if you've not got heat and you've got the virtual console collection, you can use something like the desk emulation, you can use the tape emulation, and then if it's arriving at a subgroup, we can use subgroup desk emulation as well. So that's how we could potentially introduce coloration on the tracks. Let's have a talk and go into a bit of detail then about the VCAs, because it almost sounds like, and I've had conversations with people, students as well, that are thinking that the VCA is also passing audio through it. But as you guys alluded to earlier on, the VCA is literally there to control something else. The clue's in the title, controlled. And as Andy had me rename my bus earlier on to differentiate between the bus called drums and the group called drums, I have all of my drums grouped into a group called drums so that whatever I do to one happens to all of the others. And when I link my VCAs to that drum group, this allows me to then use the VCA to control my tracks overall rather than just controlling them individually. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that Dave, that you hit on is, and this goes pretty deep into VCAs right off the bat. So notice that when you added a VCA, your other grouped tracks acted different. So your VCA track controlled all of the faders, but your individual faders operated autonomously. Right? Now, if you don't want that to happen, there's a preference for that. So go up into your preferences, and I believe it's in mixing, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. So in automation, it's the third from the bottom, standard VCA logic for group attributes. So if you unclick that,
that's a really descriptive preference right there.
now your group is basically acting as if it doesn't have a VCA on it, right?
Yes.
So all the tracks are grouped. All the other ones, I'll be honest, standard VCA for group attributes, I usually leave it on because the whole point of having the VCA is to give me a remote control, and I have individual control over all the members of my groups at the same time. So it's something I usually leave on. But if you want to have that same kind of behavior, just understand what standard VCA logic for group attributes does. And yes, Avid is the very best company for naming stuff.
Yeah, and I never ever turn this off. I mean, that defeats the whole point of having a VCA, I think. So I never ever turn it off.
It kind of does, but it can also be a head scratcher. So just if you're wondering why that behavior is happening, it's that preference.
Yeah, so I love using VCAs because you still have individual automation active on each of these tracks, and if they have individual automation, and you pull the VCA, you will actually have that same automation just being moved up or down with your VCA. So it's a great feature to be able to manage loudness criteria and stuff like that. It's something that we use a lot also when mixing Dolby Atmos, for instance.
And that's the key, right? It is a VCA track is like a group trim tool. Right, or group trim automation is probably a better way. And so what the VCA track is doing is it's modifying the fader motion of the individual tracks, which modifies the volume output level going to the aux track.
Yeah, and by the way, when you're talking about this, as you can see in the VCA master here, you don't have any inserts or sends, which again reflects the thing that it's not passing any audio through it. And when you press play now, Dave, if you would play a little bit here, Dave has a mix of mono tracks and stereo tracks here. And the VCA is only displaying 1 meter. So it looks like a mono track. And what it's actually showing is the loudest track in every at every given point in time. So it switches between all of the tracks and just displays the currently loudest track. And since he's a mix of mono and stereo tracks, or even if he had a 5.1 track or anything, it would show up as just 1 meter. But if they were all stereo tracks, it would show stereo instead, or all 5.1, he would have a 5.1.
By the way, if there's no group assigned to that VCA, then there's no meter. The meter goes away. It just goes blank. Just like that. So, boink, it's going to go away in a second. Or not.
Or not.
I didn't think it went away. I thought they always stayed there.
No, it does. I think once it has a meter, it keeps it. But when you create a new VCA,
let's try.
It's a blank thing.
By the way, one thing.
Oh yeah, okay,
there you go.
There you go.
One thing that I used to use VCAs for a lot before Folder Tracks was a very, very quick way to solo one section of your mix. It's because it has a solo button. So if you press the solo button on the VCA, you would actually hear only the drums, which is not the case if you press the solo button in the Aux track, right? Because that would mute all of the individual tracks instead. So it was a great way to just solo a group of tracks, to have them grouped to a VCA.
And this is one important difference between an Aux track and a routing folder, because a routing folder in that regard operates a lot like a VCA. So if you solo a routing folder, it doesn't mute the members of that folder.
Yep.
Right. But an Aux track would, right? Which is why we had things like solo safe and all that. The other thing too is for me, because I'll be in recording sessions and I'll have a lot of tracks to kind of keep an eye on, and I'm not necessarily worried about the levels, because the levels are right in the zone and I'm cool with it. But I really want to know if any given track is getting close to clipping. That's the number one concern for me. So if I've got big string sections or big brass sections, horns or whatever, I will always put a VCA track on there, not because I'm mixing, but I just want that meter that shows, I'll have one string VCA and it's going to show the loudest string player at any given sample. Yeah. And so I can keep an eye on that rather than keeping an eye on 50 individual string tracks.
Yeah, great tip there. Yeah.
I like using master faders for that, for monitoring buses for pretty much the same thing.
Yes, but the master fader shows summed levels of output.
Yes.
and the VCA shows the loudest individual member track at any given sample, and that's the difference, right? So if you take a look, like for example, your example here is fantastic. The meter in your drums track, the green one right there, is the summed output of all the tracks that are routed to it. But the drums VCA track meter is showing you the loudest individual member of that group at any sample.
Great.
Yeah, if you play it back again, Dave, we can just see the difference there between these two meters. You can instantly see how they correspond to each other.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. So you were talking about using automation earlier on. VCAs provide some really interesting ways of being able to have automation working.
So
let me, unless you've got something to show, let me show how that looks in the mix window.
I've shown enough.
All right. So,
but by the way, Dave, thank you for showing your screen to us.
Yes.
Yeah, that worked.
We take the small victories. So here's a track that I've got, and this is just a dumb bunch of sine waves, right? And you can see here that I've got individual different volume playlists,
automation.
Right? Yeah. So by the way, clearly this is a Grammy. There's no way that this mix is.
I mean, that mix is epic.
I mean, forget about it. And if I was to play this, then you would see up over here. You're going to see the level of the entire output of all the tracks. So this is the summed output of the tracks. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so far so good. I'm going to switch over to the mix window, and I'm going to create for myself a new VCA track.
You really don't like that second tom.
Yes, people name Tom even I don't like. I mean, I just have an issue with it.
Tom the second.
Especially that Tom Kraftwerk. That guy keeps on showing up to our shows. So you'll notice the first thing here is that there's no stereo or mono VCA track, which should tell you something. Again, there's no audio going through that. I'm just going to call this drum VCA. Great. And you'll see here that it's born without a meter. And I'll just drag this over here. And this is not a routing folder. This is a normal aux track. So I'm going to go over here, and I will then assign this to the drums group, because all of these guys are part of the drums group. The group is not Ons, but I'll prove it to you by going over here. And maybe they're not a member.
Oh, you did. You just show them. You didn't actually.
Oh, sorry.
Enable the group.
There we
right?
go. There we go. So they're all on. There we go. So the drums are right there, and I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to have it control all the members of the drum group. And now we're going to get a meter that's way over there.
It's one of those lovely graphical glitches. I found that if you hide the VCA and then re-show it, it makes a difference.
I've never ever had that glitch. Actually,
I've
heard about it, but I've never had it.
Are you on Monterey?
I'm getting a couple of video glitches that I didn't used to get, and so there's some sort of video incompatibility on my system. But here, it's back. Now, take a look at this. You will see that the meter here and the meter on the drum VCA show two different things, and maybe it's easier to show here. So I'm going to bring up this little guy right here. This is my VCA meter. And I'm going to bring up this little guy over here. This is my aux track meter. So this is the sum. The green one is the sum, and this one's going to be the loudest track at any given time. And you can see here that they are subtly different. Okay, and this one is showing me they're definitely in different ranges. Okay, Now what happens is, and I'll go, probably the easiest way to do this is to just draw something in. I'm going to draw in a VCA automation playlist. Okay, so I'm going to drive this in here and bring this over. And now all of a sudden you're going to see a blue line over here. Now, for a cookie, what is this blue line called? Dave?
It's something in my mind. I want to conflate it with trim, but it's not. I can't remember.
It is. You're
Anders?
right. Ah, yeah, it's VCA Trim Automation.
Hey!
You're both incorrect. The name of that blue line is the Composite playlist. So if you go to view, if you don't see that blue line, go to your automation.
He's lying to us, Anders.
Where are we?
Yeah, I think he's not telling the truth here.
But I didn't think I was right. But it's kind of similar to what Trim Automation's doing.
It's the Composite Automation Graph, isn't it?
It's called the Composite playlist. Why I'm looking in the wrong place. I must be looking in the wrong place.
Automation Composite Playlist. So view Automation Composite Playlist.
Why am I not seeing automation at all here?
So view Automation Composite Playlist.
I'm just not seeing an automation.
I can show my screen if you want.
Is it under other displays?
No, it's just a view. Let me grab the screen here.
Yeah, go for it. Oh, okay. Yeah, go for it.
So I'm sharing here. So this is obviously my Pro Tools here, and view automation. View automation composite playlist. That's the one that you're talking about.
So Andy's menu is wildly different.
My menu is wildly different. Okay, that's something to report. Yeah.
Which version are you guys both using?
I'm on 2021-10.
I'm on 7 still.
I'll have to log that. That's something that's missing. But
it's
called the composite.
I can see automation in 2020.10, 21.10.
I don't know. There's something weird in my world. So here's the interesting thing though, is what will happen is you'll see. So we've got this little little guy right here. So we're dipping down, and watch what happens in the mix window. Come on, go to the mix window. There we go. Watch what happens to these guys. So as it plays, the scale of these faders will follow the scaling of this one VCA track. And you'll notice that the output or the input of the aux track will scale because the output of the individual tracks are scaling. So that becomes the signal flow advantage to VCAs. Because if I was to put a compressor on this, that compressor would be post VCA, but pre fader on the subgroup, on the aux track.
Yep.
And that's the big difference to me from a signal flow perspective. That's the big difference between, what a VCA track does and what an aux track does. And for me, it's never an either or. I always use aux tracks, but I will add VCAs if I want to get that extra handle of control.
It seems
I do the exact same thing. They're exactly the same thing. I use auxes all of the time, and then I'll add a VCA if needed.
Yeah.
It seems to be a way of almost stacking automation, layered automation as such.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
It is
Yeah.
completely. And the great thing is that you can A/B comparison. You can try it with, you can suspend your VCA automation and then see what the tracks do on their own, right? Because what you're doing is it's not so. I guess it's kind of layering. It's basically the volume automation of the VCA track, or the fader automation of the VCA track, is modifying and scaling proportionally the output volume levels of the individual member tracks.
Yeah, because sorry to interrupt there, because it's actually the VCA automation is called the VCA Trim automation, so it basically trims the other tracks automation.
That's right. I shouldn't call it volume because that's not the proper name for it. But what it does then is that affects the output of the track, which affects the input of the aux track. And so and so it's so important to make sure that your levels are hitting your effects where you want them to be, or else you can, especially with analog emulation, run into coloration that you don't want.
So one of the things that I love about VCAs is we don't, on a track basis, we only have one automation window, don't we? Or one automation lane per parameter. VCAs allows us to have multiple automation passes for single tracks as such. They have to be members of groups, because obviously the VCA latches onto a group. But you could essentially program in 3 different automation passes for a kick drum, for example, by having 3 different VCAs, each connected at different times.
Yeah, which can get really messy in your head, of course, as well.
That's very cool. I don't think I've ever done that. That's really, really neat.
Yeah, you can, and I mean, when you're talking about this, you actually have something in Protos Ultimate called the trim automation as well. So, counting in trim automation, you have the basic automation, volume automation, trim automation, VCA automation, and then you can do aux movement as well. So you have a lot of ways to affecting your automation. Yeah.
Well, let me just talk about that briefly then. So if I create us another 2 VCAs, VCA drums 2, and then what did I want? VCA drums 3. Have them all sat next to each other. We can only assign one VCA to one group at a time. Can't we? So
makes sense.
So let's say we program in a VCA pass there. We can see that my drums are going to be reacting obviously to what the VCA is doing there. And let's say I really like that, but I want to audition something completely different. So we'll draw in that. We'll disconnect that VCA. We'll connect that VCA. See my meter down there.
Yeah, so you're basically creating alternatives for your automation. Great. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That is so cool.
We can see that the other VCA is still responding, and there shouldn't be any changes at the track level, should there? Because I'm not moving anything specifically on the track. The VCA is literally controlling everything. So, yeah. Different automation passes, different level types. Something radio mixes for vocals where you want them slightly louder, maybe. Drums slightly softer, just auditioning slightly softer. It's just different ways of being able to make the your tracks respond differently using automation, but not actually programming them onto the tracks themselves. I love that.
That's a great trick.
You know what?
A great trick.
I have never done that before, and I will steal that mercilessly. This is such a great show. God, this is such a good show.
I'll show you the thing that I've stolen.
Oh.
There you go, baby. By the way, another thing that VCAs can do that will potentially melt your noodle is you can automate. You can do trim automation on VCA tracks. Mm-hmm. I believe I have to double check that.
Let's have a look. Yeah, trim automation.
Now, that's a little bit different. It's going to be different behavior on Pro Tools Standard and Pro Tools Ultimate.
Only available in Pro Tools Ultimate, right?
That's right.
I just realised I wasn't sharing the screen. How normal of me. There you go. So trim automation, VCA track, programming indifferences.
And by the way, a little note for our head scratch moment before the automation view menu item was not showing on my system because at the time I was running Pro Tools Standard, which I'm using for writing a book. Pro Tools Ultimate has the automation view menu item where you can choose to show or not show the composite playlist.
It's so easy for us to forget that when you're working in one version of the app.
Yeah, completely. I'll be honest. I had to check it to make sure that I was right, and I'm like, I bet you that was going on. And I just rebooted as Pro Tools Ultimate, and it came back. So that was clearly.
Oh, that's all quick. Yeah, that explains stuff because I've actually had a similar issue during a course where I had remote students sitting on standard Pro Tools, and I couldn't figure out why they didn't have that menu item.
Right.
Thanks.
Right. Yep. So there we go. So really, I would say that the choice whether to use an Aux track or a VCA track should be made on a signal flow criterion rather than a tone coloration criterion, because there's no tone coloration with either one of those.
It's a mute point.
It's the same either way, right? But where you're controlling your outputs and your inputs, where in that signal flow, diagram, that's where you want to go. And I'll be honest, and I think it sounds like we all work the same way. Is our default position is to use an aux for subgroups, and then what we'll do is we'll add a VCA when we need to have control over the signal feeding that aux group.
Yeah, indeed. It's an extra level of control because we can do automation on the tracks, we can do automation on the subgroups themselves. It's just an extra level of complexity.
Yeah, and to get back to one of the comments that you mentioned in the beginning here, Andy, where you said bussing stuff into other buses and multiple auxes after each other is really not a problem within Pro Tools usually. Of course, there are some considerations if you're using HDX in a classic configuration and you're actually using these P effects. But that's a whole other show that we can do some other time. And if you want to hear more about that, let us know in the comments below.
Yeah. So I think we've wrapped up Stephen's question, and it led us to talk way more about VCAs than probably he was asking about in the thing. But it was just a great opportunity to talk about a feature that doesn't usually get a lot of love.
No. Not, and it's often misunderstood, but it's really powerful when you need it.
Yeah, very much like the master fader track, and I think we'll end up.
Let's do a show about master faders.
Let's definitely do a show on those.
We usually tend to do shows responding to questions. Shall we just ask a question about master faders.
Yeah, I'll post a question in the forum.
Yeah, there we go.
Some doofus called Anders.
Yeah, no. You should post it. You should post it from Tom Craftworks account.
Okay, so Stephen, I hope that helped, and the rest of you, I hope that was an interesting delve into.
Great question.
Yeah,
Yep.
what aux tracks are, and bringing into the conversation VCA faders. Jump on them. They add a wonderful level of control to what you're doing. So if you're enjoying what we're doing, it would be great if you could hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Hit the like button as well. If you're liking the videos, it tells YouTube that we're doing good stuff. It serves up the video to more people. We can help more users like you. You can head over to protoolsanswers.com where you can subscribe over there as well. And subscribers at protoolsanswers.com get an email from Andy every week with some nice stuff in it. And if you want to support what we're doing, you can head over to patreon.com/ProToolsAnswers where you can pick one of the support tiers. If you fancy making a one-time donation to the channel, you can also do that at protoolsanswers.com as well. We have a PayPal link over there, and any help is very graciously received. All it's been to say is thank you as ever to Anders.
Thank you.
Thank you to Andy.
You betcha.
My name's Dave. This is Pro Tools Answers, and we're not sponsored by Avid, but we are out.